Chapter 15. Paleface Archer. The boys whirled to face the speaker. He was a tall, raw-boned man wearing a Stetson felt hat and a sheriff's badge pinned to the olive-gray jacket of his uniform. Under arrest for what? Frank asked. Breaking and entering will do for a start. We didn't break in, Sheriff. The door was open. Frank identified himself and his brother as well as Chet and explained that they were investigating the werewolf mystery. On hearing that two of the youths were the sons of the famous detective, Fenton Hardy, the lawman relaxed his angry expression somewhat and even shook hands. I'm Sheriff Koenig, he told them. You can forget what I said about being under arrest, but that still doesn't excuse you for poking around without permission. I'm the local law officer. If you're up here to work on a case, you should have checked in with me first. The Hardys thought it best not to argue. We're still fairly new at detective work, Sheriff. We don't have your experience at crime fighting, Frank said diplomatically. I guess we have a few things to learn. The raw-boned police officer seemed mollified by Frank's attitude and shrugged. A bit pompously. We all have to start somewhere, he said. What's that you're holding, young fellow? A wolf skin, Joe said, handing it over. Koenig examined the hide, obviously mystified but doing his best to look professional. I'll take charge of this. It may be important evidence. How did you know we were here, Sheriff? Joe inquired. I didn't. Just got a phone tip that it might be worthwhile to take a look in John Tabor's cabin. He added, as your dad may have told you, that's one of the most important techniques in police work, gathering leads from informers. Any idea who the caller was? Frank asked. Sheriff Koenig cleared his throat. Actually, no. He didn't leave any name. But he spoke with a foreign accent. The lawman fished a gleaming metal pellet from his jacket pocket and held it out to show the boys. Here's something else that may interest you fellows. Strictly off the record, you understand. A silver bullet, Joe exclaimed. Where'd it come from, Sheriff? When that werewolf was prowling around last night, someone took a shot at it. I dug this out of the bark of the tree where it hit. Didn't get too mashed up. Chet started to say something. Frank sensed that he might be about to mention the bullet fired into the Hardys' front door in Bayport, which might have led to lengthy questioning by the sheriff. So he silenced his chum with a quick frown. Instead, Chet said, silver bullets are what people used to say it took to kill a werewolf, right? The sheriff nodded. Uh-huh. And this isn't the only one that turned up. Frank flashed him a startled glance. Where else? Somebody fired one at Corral Tabor this morning. Happened just as he was climbing into his helicopter to take off for New York. Did anyone spot the gunman? Nope. The shot came from the woods near the Tabor's house. Whoever it was. Looks as if someone around Hawk River may figure the best way to get rid of werewolves is to wipe out the Tabor family. After telling the sheriff where they could be reached, the Hardys headed back to their car with Chet. Both Frank and Joe were worried that the furry clue they had discovered in the hut might cause fresh trouble for the Tabors. You think the sheriff would go as far as tossing John in the clink? Chet asked owlishly. He just might, Frank replied, if people around here get worked up enough about the werewolf attacks. I still don't see how anyone could be deceived by that wolf skin, though, Joe argued. Even if someone strapped it to his arms and body, I wouldn't be fooled into thinking it was a real werewolf. Neither would I, Chet chimed in. And it sure wouldn't explain that glowing wolf creature we saw at the Bayport diner, Frank pointed out. Suddenly Joe snapped his fingers. Hey, I'll bet I know where that pelt came from. Where? Off that stuffed wolf that got stolen from Alec Virgil. That would explain the glass eyes. Right, his brother agreed. Someone just emptied out the stuffing, I think. You've hit it, Joe. Frank was thoughtful when they arrived at the cottage. Do you suppose the Mohawks knew anything about werewolves? He mused. Sure, Joe replied. That book by Desmond Quorn says that American Indian tribes had lots of folktales about people turning into animals. Why? Hank Eagle said his uncle's a medicine man, remember? Just for the fun of it. I'd like to hear what he has to say about this werewolf scare. Who knows, he might come up with some kind of Indian lore or wolf hunting gimmick that we could use to distract people around here and take some of the heat off the Tabors. Frank looked at his two companions. Are you game to drive to Hank's village? Joe nodded, and Chet was positively enthusiastic about the idea. A visit with the Indians, he felt, would give him a chance to soak up some real wilderness know-how. When the trio set off in the car again a short time later, the stout youth was clad in his fringed buckskin hunting shirt and headband, and even brought along his bow and arrows. The Mohawk village, as they found out by asking directions, lay only a few miles from Hawk River. To Chet's disappointment, it consisted only of a few weather-beaten houses and cabins, and the people, aside from their coppery complexions and, in some cases, braided hair, seemed no different from other local Americans. "Chet looks more Indian than they do," Joe remarked with a chuckle to Frank. The Mohawks seemed to think so too. When the boys climbed out of the car, a group of children who had been playing in front of the general store immediately surrounded the chubby visitor, admiring his bow and arrows and asking questions about his costume. Meantime, Frank and Joe asked where Hank Eagle's uncle lived. His name was Adam Eagle, and he proved to be a thin, gnarled-looking old man with a beaky nose and high cheekbone face. When he heard that his callers were friends of his nephew, he greeted them with a firm handshake. "Sego, Tanangawa, my friends. How are you?" The boys chatted with him and found out that Adam Eagle, too, had been a high stealer in his youth. He had helped build the George Washington Bridge across the Hudson River and the Empire State Building, but now worked as a carpenter. "An odd job, man." "Hank told us you were a medicine man," Joe remarked. The elderly Mohawk shrugged. "Sometimes I make herbal remedies for my neighbors when they are ill, and perform tribal ceremonies." It turned out that he had already heard about the werewolf attacks at Hawk River. When Frank asked his opinion about them and how the trouble could be stopped, at first Mr. Eagle would say little. But finally, as a favor to the boys, he donned an Indian costume and built a small fire of twigs in the fireplace of his cabin. He played eerily on a red cedar flute. Then, shaking a pair of gourd rattles and speaking in the Mohawk tongue, he began calling on Jo, the spirit of the winds. Frank and Joe got goose pimples listening to the weird chant. Afterward, the old man said to them, "The woods are full of mystery, my friends. Most people have lost touch with nature. Who can say whether or not men may become like animals? Still, I think the trouble you speak of comes not from any wolf. I see you in the fire, hunting down evil persons." Somewhat mystified but impressed, the Hardys thanked the medicine man and went out to look for Chet. They found him showing off his skill at archery, taking turns with some of the village teenagers, shooting arrows at a makeshift target. The Indian youths clapped when he managed to hit the bullseye every time. But none of the Bayporters could match the Mohawks when it came to hurling a hickory lance at a rolling ring. Later they played the deer button game. The buttons, made of polished horn, were each charred on one side. The players shook the buttons in one hand like dice, then threw them on a blanket, trying to make 6 or more buttons land with the same side turned up. Much to his delight, Chet won more games than anyone else. He and the Hardys were invited by the villagers to stay for supper. It was a feast of corn soup, fried trout, venison, succotash, squash, cornbread, and blueberry pie. Before the visitors left, some of the village girls presented Chet with a beaded headband they had sewed as a prize for his marksmanship with bow and arrow. "Onagekwahi," the Mohawks called, waving goodbye. Chet was so proud of the trophy he wanted to show it off to Elena. He asked the Hardys to stop by the Tabor's house when they returned to Hawk River. However, when it came to ringing the bell, he seemed a bit nervous. "What's the matter?" Frank asked, feeling shy. "That goofy housekeeper doesn't like me," Chet confessed sheepishly as he got out of the car. "What if she answers the door?" Dusk had fallen and the boys saw Elena pass in front of a lighted window. Then, the light went out. Chet had a sudden inspiration. He wrote a note to Elena, tied it to an arrow, and strode halfway up the drive while Frank and Joe waited in the car. He aimed at Elena's still open window and let the arrow fly. Unfortunately, his nervousness must have spoiled his aim. There was a loud tinkle of glass and Chet froze in horror. His arrow had crashed into the wrong window. Next moment the front door burst open and Pocahontas charged out, bellowing and brandishing a Chapter 16. Tomahawk Reward. "Clear outta here, you no good," the huge housekeeper roared, shaking her broomstick weapon. "I'll teach you to come breaking windows in this house." Chet pounded down the drive in panic as fast as his chubby legs could carry him. "Gun the engine," he shouted while still 10 yards from the car. "How come?" teased Joe, who was at the wheel. Don't you want to stick around till Elena reads your note? Never mind the wisecracks, just get going. Chet leaped aboard, bug-eyed and puffing. Think I want that giantess to brain me with her war club? Once back in the safety of their cottage, the stout youth began stoking up on cocoa and donuts. Having someone like Pocahontas chase after him is hard on a guy's nerves, he said plaintively. I have to recharge my batteries. Good idea, said Frank. We may need your full power tonight. What for? Chet blurted, eyeing the Hardy boys suspiciously. All three of us are going to stake out the Tabor's house. If any of those guys who were out there last night show up again, we'll nab them. Around 9:30, just as the boys were about to leave the cabin, the phone rang. Joe answered. The caller was Hank Eagle. I just got home from New York, the Mohawk high stealer said. My uncle told me you were here at the village this afternoon. Sorry I missed you. Same here, Joe said. But we sure enjoyed the visit. Your uncle's a fine man, Hank. He thinks you Hardys are pretty special too. When he made medicine over the fire, he says Gio told him you could be trusted, so he advised me to tell you the truth. About what? About that sneaky dude you met in the restaurant, the one who called himself Mr. Nest. His real name is Marburg. We already found that out, Joe said. But if you've got something more to tell us, wait till I get Frank on the line so he can hear it too. The Hardys were fascinated as they listened to the story Hank Eagle related. After the Revolutionary War, his ancestor Dark Eagle had sailed on a British troopship, carrying redcoats home to England. In London, King George had presented his fierce Indian ally with a silver tomahawk in reward for his services to the crown. Made by a famous English silversmith, the tomahawk was decorated with a gold design and embossed with several diamonds. Wow! What happened to it? Joe exclaimed. Nobody knows, Hank replied. Remember, that was 200 years ago. Somehow the tomahawk got lost or disappeared from sight during those 2 centuries. But when you told me what Marburg said in the restaurant, I knew right away that's what he was after. Frank said. How would he know about the tomahawk? From history books. It's no secret. Anyone who's interested in antiques could have heard about it. Hank went on to tell that his family possessed an old journal or diary kept by Dark Eagle. Many pages are too faded and moldy to read, but from various legible remarks, I'm sure the tomahawk is hidden somewhere at Eagle's Nest. Would Marburg know about that diary too? Joe asked. Probably. We've tried our best to keep it secret. In fact, it's stored in a safe deposit box. But several historians know Dark Eagle kept such a diary, so the news may easily have leaked out to Marburg. Hank said he became more and more convinced of this when Marburg came to see him and tried to work his way into the Mohawk's confidence. Then when he saw you guys talking to me and recognized you from news pictures as the sons of Fenton Hardy, he probably figured you were after the same prize he was. Frank told the high stealer about the chat he and Joe had with Mr. Crawford and added, probably Marburg figured if you didn't have the diary, it might just turn up when the old mansion is restored. Quite likely, Hank agreed. And he's hoping if he can lay hands on it that the diary will clue him in to what happened to the tomahawk. The Hardys thanked the construction worker for telling them his family's secret. They also promised to let him know if they gained any clues to the whereabouts of the tomahawk. Then they set off with Chet for the Tabor estate. Parking their car out of sight, the boys chose a different tree from the one Chet had used for his lookout post. All three found places to perch themselves in its sturdy branches. In the moonlight they could see the house clearly. Less than half an hour later, Joe hissed a soft warning and pointed to the left. A stealthy figure had just emerged from among the trees and was moving closer to the house. You stay here, Chet, Frank whispered, and keep your eyes peeled for any other intruders. Joe and I'll go get this guy, okay? Check, their stout chum agreed. Letting themselves down from the tree, the Hardys closed in fast and silently on their quarry. He had taken up a position in a clump of shrubbery, which gave him a view of both the patio and the front of the house. But he was unprepared for an assault from behind. Before he realized what was happening, Frank hooked an arm around his windpipe and clamped a hand over his mouth. Joe grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it painfully behind him. Between them, they marched him well out of earshot of the house. He was the mustached man whom they had seen leaving Dr. Benton's office at the Pine Manor Rest home. Suppose you tell us what you're doing here spying on the Tabors, Frank said. Why should I tell you anything? The prisoner retorted. Because if you don't we'll call Sheriff Koenig and you can try explaining to him, Joe warned. The mustached man scowled and hesitated, then shrugged. Okay, you win. My name's Elmo Yancey. I'm a private eye. Prove it, snapped Frank. The man pulled a billfold from his inside coat pocket. He opened it and presented them with his private investigator's license for the state of New York. The Hardys inspected it, and Frank nodded. Good enough. Yancey said he had been hired by a client to investigate and report on the Tabor family, especially the son. After coming to Hawk River, he heard about the werewolf who was said to be haunting the area. Then he read the news story, hinting that John Tabor might be the culprit due to a family taint. Next day, an unsigned note came to his motel in the mail, informing him that the young architect had been a mental patient at the Pine Manor rest home, so he went there to try to interview John's doctor. What about last night? And don't hand us any baloney, Frank added. You were under surveillance. Then why ask? We want to hear your version. It's one way to find out if you're leveling with us. Yancey said he had decided to keep watch on the Tabor house to see if John slipped out after dark and had anything to do with the werewolf attacks. He showed all right and he was acting pretty odd. How do you mean? Joe said. He was moving like a sleepwalker, almost as if he were in a trance. Followed him for a while. He headed up a hillside, a little way north of here. I lost sight of him for a moment or two, but then I saw a gleam of light appear up near the top of the hill. Frank frowned on hearing this. Chet had made no mention of any light. However, Frank reflected that it might not have been visible from their chum's position farther down the hillside. Right after that, Yancey went on, I heard a scuffle break out somewhere below me. John Tabor must have heard it too because the light went out and then I caught sight of him again. Yancey said that the young architect had headed homeward by a different route. The investigator himself had followed in order to make sure of where John was going. Afterward, Yancey had returned to the hillside to check on the scene of the scuffle but found no one there. He had then discovered the hut near the top of the hill from where the light had come. You looked inside? Frank inquired. Naturally. It wasn't locked. Did you see a wolf skin in there? The private eye seemed startled by the question, but shook his head. No. Just books and architectural drawing gear. It looked as if John had used the place as a private studio where he could go off to study or work on plans. You're sure there was no fur pelt lying around? Joe persisted. Positive. If there'd been anything like that, you can bet I'd have spotted it. The Hardys exchanged glances. If Yancey's testimony was true, then the wolf skin must have been planted in the hut later, maybe by the same person who had tipped off the sheriff. How come you're back tonight? Frank inquired. Yancey shrugged. I didn't really learn anything last evening. I figured tonight I might be luckier. But it sure didn't turn out that way, he added ruefully. Who is your client? The older Hardy asked abruptly, hoping he might catch the detective off guard. You don't expect me to answer that, do you? No ethical private investigator reveals his client's identity without permission. We understand. Frank grinned and introduced himself and Joe. Elmo Yancey's attitude changed immediately on learning that they were the sons of Fenton Hardy. He promised to tell them his client's name if and when he was allowed to do so. Meanwhile, he stayed with the Hardys and Chet, keeping watch on the Tabor's house. But when nothing happened by midnight, he abandoned his vigil. The Bayport trio maintained their stakeout an hour longer. Then they too gave up for the night. Next morning, Frank and Joe were relieved to get a radio call from their father. They filled him in on all that had happened, both in New York and in Hawk River. Fenton Hardy, in turn, revealed that Bubbles Upton, the son of the burly architect, was now working on the side of the law trying to make up for the crime that had led to his jail sentence and thus redeem himself in the eyes of the authorities. Is he helping you on this case, Dad? Joe inquired. Yes, he's checking out the possibility that a crooked contractor may be mixed up in those building disasters. Same angle Neil Xavier mentioned to us? Right. But now I want you fellows to check out a brand new lead for me in New York City. It may be urgent, so I'm sending Jack Wayne to fly you there. The detective gave his sons careful instructions and on Chet's request agreed that their stout chum could go with them. One other thing, Dad, put in Frank. Could you give us the name of a psychiatrist in New York that we could talk to while we're there? I'd like to get another opinion on John Tabor's behavior. Good idea, said Fenton Hardy. He named a reliable expert whom he himself had consulted in connection with various criminal cases. Thanks, Dad, and watch yourself. Remember the warning note Bubbles sent to us in Central Park. Right, son, and you do the same. This assignment could be dangerous. Jack Wayne often flew Mr. Hardy's private plane Sky Happy Sal. An hour after the detective's call, the small craft landed at an airfield near Hawk River. The boys greeted the friendly pilot, then all set off for LaGuardia Airport in New York. From there they taxied to the address Fenton Hardy had given them in a slummy area of the Bronx. It was a narrow-fronted, two-story brownstone house, squeezed between half-ruined tenement buildings. The boys scouted the scene. First, then rang the bell. No one answered. Doors open, Joe noted. Let's go in. Frank led the way cautiously, through a dirty tiled vestibule into the first-floor living room. All three gasped at the sight of a motionless figure lying, bound and gagged on the floor. It's Bubbles Upton, Joe exclaimed. Chet blurted in dismay. He's Chapter 17. The Flying Chicken. Frank rushed across the room with his two companions close behind and they examined the man on the floor. It was apparent from his bruised face and torn, red-stained clothes that young Upton had been badly beaten, but he was still breathing and Frank was able to detect a fairly strong pulse. He'll be okay if we get him to a doctor, the older Hardy boy declared. Help me untie him. He took off Bubbles' gag while Joe and Chet removed the rope from the young man's wrists and ankles. Then they lifted him onto a sofa. Joe hurried into the kitchen to fetch a glass of water. A few swallows were forced between the victim's lips as Frank chafed his wrists. Soon young Upton opened his eyes. How did you guys get here? He asked weakly. My father sent us, Frank informed him. Thank goodness. Then he must have clued in to my code signal. Bubbles explained that he had paid a ham radio operator to broadcast a call when he could not reach Fenton Hardy by phone. Joe said. Feel strong enough to tell us what happened? I'll try, Bubbles responded. He said he had been hired by mobsters to crack the Chelsea Builders safe. And I'm sure those same crooks who hired me are in cahoots with the contractor your father's investigating. What did they want out of the safe? Frank asked. Some sound tapes. A look flashed between the Hardys. Once again Neil Xavier's charges seemed to be confirmed by outside testimony. Do you know what was on them? Frank pursued. Bubbles shook his head painfully. No. I tried to play them to find out, but the mobsters caught me and beat me up. They planned to dump me in the river. After dark. Both Hardys wondered if young Upton realized the tapes might incriminate his own father, but they decided not to risk upsetting him while he was in such condition. We'll call an ambulance and get you to a hospital pronto, Frank promised, looking around for a telephone. But Bubbles insisted that it would be safer all around if the Hardys stayed out of the picture completely so that no one could connect him with them or their father. Besides, I'm not in bad enough shape to need an ambulance, he gasped hoarsely. A taxi will do. He protested so anxiously that the Hardys gave in. Joe hurried to the nearby corner and flagged a cruising cab. Bubbles Upton was helped into it, and the driver instructed to take him to the closest hospital. The three Bayporters then proceeded by subway to the office of the psychiatrist that Fenton Hardy had recommended. The receptionist told them that the detective had already phoned for an emergency appointment, and after a short wait, they were waved into the doctor's consulting room. Dr. Fazoli, a bespectacled man with thick, dark hair fringing his bald head, asked the boys how he could help them. Frank described John Tabor's weird behavior. Is there any way a person could be influenced to do such things? He went on, and then not even remember what happened. Of course, the doctor nodded. Almost anyone could be made to behave that way by post-hypnotic suggestion. To accomplish this, he explained the person would first be hypnotized, then given an order to carry out after he woke up from his trance, perhaps quite a while afterward. The more often a person is hypnotized, Dr. Fazoli went on, the easier it comes to control him. Yet, when he snapped out of his trance, he may not even remember being given any orders. Would he recall carrying them out? Frank asked. Not if he'd been programmed to forget them, Joe said. But how would he know when to carry out the order? Usually the programming involves some sort of signal, replied the doctor. For instance, the hypnotist may say, when you see me scratch my ear, you will do so and so. And later on, after the patient's been brought out of his trance, the hypnotist scratches his ear and the patient does exactly what he was told to do. With a smile, Dr. Fazoli added, if you ask him why he did such a thing, he'll make up all sorts of reasons. It never seems to occur to him that he may be carrying out a post-hypnotic suggestion. Suddenly Frank remembered how John had been called to the phone during the barbecue party. A little later, when he came out of the house again, he had acted like a zombie. How about a signal over the phone? He inquired. Would that work? Perfectly, said Dr. Fazoli. In fact, the phone voice, if it is a voice, could be used to reinforce or strengthen the original command. But the signal could just as easily be a buzzer or a hand clap or a certain bit of music. Whatever. What if the person didn't want to carry out the command? Once he's been hypnotized, he has no choice. Chet had been listening with a skeptical expression. Maybe some people are like that, he scoffed. But I'd like to see somebody make me do something I didn't want to do. Dr. Fazoli smiled. Shall we try? Go ahead, Chet challenged him. The doctor held up a shiny coin on the end of a chain. He asked the chubby youth to gaze at it as it swung to and fro. Then, in a monotonous voice, he began to suggest that Chet was feeling relaxed and drowsy, that his limbs were growing heavier and losing all feeling, and finally that Chet would do whatever he was told. Chet carried out several simple commands, such as shivering as if he were cold, barking like a dog, and dancing around the room. But later, after the doctor snapped his fingers to bring him out of his trance, Chet insisted he had never even been in a trance. I was wide awake all along. I knew what was going on. When you asked me to do something, I cooperated, but I didn't have to do it. The doctor shrugged and smiled. Perhaps so. Many subjects feel that way. The fact remains that you did what I told you to. The Hardys grinned and thanked Dr. Fazoli for his information and demonstration. Before leaving the office, Frank asked the receptionist if he might use her phone. Of course, she said. Let me get you an outside line first, then just dial the number. Frank had Jack Wayne paged at LaGuardia Airport. When the pilot answered, the young detective told him to start warming up Sky Happy Sal. The boys would be ready for takeoff as soon as they taxied to the airfield. Maybe not as soon as you think, Jack replied. He said that an urgent message had been relayed from Bayport. From whom? Frank asked. Some guy employed by Chelsea Builders named Neil Xavier. He phoned your home. Your aunt broadcast his message, and I picked it up on the radio. What does he want? To see you and Joe as soon as possible. He says it's very important, but the meeting must be kept secret. You're to come to his apartment on Central Park West instead of the company office. The boys were soon on their way by taxi to Xavier's address. Who is this guy?
Chet Asquet en route.
Carell Tabor's executive assistant, Joe told him. When they arrived at his apartment, the trio were surprised to find themselves facing a big, powerful, snarling Doberman guard dog held on a tight leash by Neil Xavier, who seemed tense and frightened. I rented him from a trainer last night for protection, Xavier told the boys. Sit down, please, and I'll explain. Pacing nervously back and forth while his dog sat watchfully eyeing the three visitors, Xavier began. I've made a very unpleasant discovery. Much as I hate to say so, I now believe that the real criminal behind the firm's troubles is none other than my boss, Carell Tabor. The Bayporters were shocked by the news. What makes you think so? Joe asked keenly. Xavier explained that Tabor, despite his brilliant reputation, had long been at odds with Chelsea Builders' board of directors. He had therefore deliberately arranged the 3 building disasters which Mr. Hardy was investigating, in order to force down the price of Chelsea Builders stock. Frank frowned. Why would he want to do that? So he can buy it up cheaply and gain control of the company. How did he arrange the disasters? Joe asked. Through that crooked contractor I mentioned. All 3 were due to sabotage, carried out by mobsters. He told me those tapes contained evidence linking the contractor with Upton Associates. But now I'm sure they implicated Tabor. himself. He was keeping them as insurance to make sure the contractor didn't double-cross him. How did you find all this out? Frank inquired. Just a lucky break, if you can call it lucky. Xavier explained that, by chance, he had overheard a phone conversation between Tabor and the contractor. They were setting up a meeting at 10 o'clock tonight at a house near Hawk River. If they get wise that I was listening in, my life won't be worth a plugged nickel. After learning the cabin's location, the boys taxied to LaGuardia and flew back to the Adirondacks. Frank and Joe had left their car parked at the airfield near Hawk River. On landing, they drove to the cabin. Frank braked to a stop and said, "Well, here we are." Chet immediately leaped out of the car, flapping his arms. "Look, I'm a chicken," he cried, cackling loudly. "I can fly." "Good for you," said a girl's voice. "May I watch you take off?" Chet whirled and saw Elena Tabor walking toward Chapter 18. 9 o'clock shadow. Chet's face blushed fiery red with embarrassment when he suddenly realized what he was doing. The Hardys burst out laughing. "Good grief," Chet moaned. "Whatever made me do such a goofy thing?" "A post-hypnotic suggestion, that's what," said Joe. "Huh. You were just doing what you were told to do," Frank added. Chet stared at the Hardys, his cheeks still flaming. "What are you guys talking about?" Frank explained that, while under hypnosis in the psychiatrist's office, Dr. Fazoli had ordered their chum to act like a flying chicken when they arrived at their cabin. "Cheer up, Chet," Joe chuckled. "He only did it to convince you such things are possible. Frank signaled you when he said, 'Well, here we are.'" To save Chet further embarrassment, Frank turned to their visitor. "What's up, Elena?" Her face fell after her momentary amusement. "Oh, I'm so worried about John," she replied. "Sheriff Koenig's been grilling him all afternoon. He's even warned him not to leave Hawk River. Dad and I are afraid he may soon be arrested." "Well, you can stop worrying," Frank told her. "I think we've just found out what makes your brother take those midnight strolls." "What do you mean?" Elena exclaimed, her eyes widening in surprise. Frank reported what they had learned from the psychiatrist about post-hypnotic suggestion and went on, "I'm convinced something like that must have happened to John. Someone has hypnotized him deeply and ordered him to leave the house in the middle of the night. Do you remember whether he got a late phone call just before bedtime on Wednesday night?" "Yes, as a matter of fact, he did." "Why?" "Same thing happened the night of the barbecue. Those calls may be from the person who hypnotized him to give him reinforcing suggestions. Later, a wolf howl outside, even if it's a fake howl, is the signal that prompts him to leave the house. It would also explain why he acts like he's in a trance," said Joe. "Chet's just demonstrated to you how the whole thing works." The plump girl's face broke into a happy smile. "Oh, that's wonderful," she gushed. "You've no idea how relieved Dad will be when I tell him." "Thank you. Also very much." Before Chet realized what was happening, Elena flung her arms around his neck and kissed him a resounding smack on the cheek. The chubby bay porter's cheeks turned flaming pink again, but this time with bashful pleasure rather than embarrassment. Meanwhile, Frank and Joe exchanged hasty glances of amusement mixed with concern. Both were thinking the same thing, that they had better not tell Elena about Neil Xavier's accusation against her father, and thus spoil her happiness of the moment. She drove off in her red mini-wagon soon afterward, eager to tell her father the good news. Later, as the boys were finishing supper, they heard a knock. Frank got up to answer the door. Their visitor proved to be Elmo Yancey. "Come on in," Frank said. "You're just in time for a cup of coffee." "Thanks. Don't mind if I do." The private eye joined them at the table and proceeded to tell the news that had brought him to their cabin. "I just got a cablegram over the phone from my client. It's in reply to one I sent him this morning, and it gives me permission to use my judgment about telling you his name. But the information must be kept in strict confidence, of course." "We understand," Frank assured him. "You can count on us to keep our lips zipped." "Who is he?" Joe asked eagerly. "A wealthy European businessman who lives in Paris. His name is Gustave Tabor." "Tabor," Joe echoed and shot a glance at Frank. "That must be the distant cousin Mr. Tabor mentioned to us, the one who escaped to the west just before Czechoslovakia went communist." "Right," Frank agreed, and turned to Elmo Yancey. "How come he hired you to report on the American branch of the family. Because he's old and rich and looking for an heir. He has no children of his own, so he's decided to leave his fortune to the youngest male Tabor over here. But first he wants a character check on both John and his father Corell Tabor to see if John is worthy of inheriting. Chet whistled and murmured, "Well, what do you know?" The Hardys thanked Yancey for the information. Later, after he had gone, Joe said to his brother, "You realize this may explain the whole werewolf business?" Frank nodded thoughtfully. "I'll say I do. Could mean someone's deliberately trying to smear John and ruin his chances of inheriting Gustav Tabor's fortune." "Right. But who?" Joe mused. "You want a suggestion? Let's hear it. How about the Frenchman who called on Desmond Quorn for information about the Tabor family werewolves?" "Hey, you're right," Joe exclaimed, socking his fist into his palm. Then he steals the file and mails it, along with a copy of the magazine article, to the editor of the local newspaper, just to make sure everyone gets the message. That John's slightly nutty and gets Wolfman delusions every full moon. Which wouldn't help John's chances of becoming Gustav Tabor's heir. Frank agreed. And to put him even deeper into the soup, Joe went on, the Frenchman gets hold of a wolf skin and plants it in John's studio hut. Just two things wrong with your theory, Frank mused. What? Spoke up Chet, who was munching donuts and listening to the Hardys' conversation with great interest. 1. It doesn't explain the glowing wolf creature. Joe cocked a quizzical eyebrow. And 2. Even if we're right, said Frank, why is the culprit doing it and how do we find him? We don't know a thing about him. Wrong, said Chet between mouthfuls of pastry. You know at least one thing about him. Name it, Frank said. He said his name was Julian Sorrel. So, what? Joe shrugged. It's not likely he'd use his real name. Frank puckered his forehead. Probably not. But Chet may have a point there. That name might just mean something to a member of the Tabor family. Could be. Let's give it a whirl. Picking up the telephone, Joe called the Tabor's number. Elena answered. After telling her who he was, Joe said, Does the name Julian Sorrel mean anything to you, Elena? Of course. Who is he? The hero of a famous French novel by Stendhal, called The Red and the Black. Joe groaned. Thanks anyhow, Elena, but forget I asked. Shortly before 9 o'clock, the Hardys set out by car for the house where Corell Tabor was to meet the crooked contractor. Xavier had told the boys its exact location, which he had overheard while eavesdropping on the plotters' telephone conversation. The Hardys hoped to arrive in time to stake out the place before the meeting took place. Meanwhile, they left Chet to hold the fort and keep watch on the Tabor's house. Frank was at the wheel as they tooled along the forest-fringed highway in the moonlight. Don't look now, Joe, he murmured, but I think we're being tailed. Lights in the rearview mirror? No. Its headlights are out. That's what worries me, but I can see the car fairly well as long as the moon doesn't go behind a cloud. Whoever it is, he's been keeping the same distance behind us for almost 10 miles. Joe proposed a plan which Frank thought might work, although it had possible dangers. The older Hardy slowed his speed somewhat, keeping an eye peeled for any turnoffs. Presently he wheeled right onto a rutted lane which wound among a stand of oaks and evergreens, interspersed with clumps of underbrush. The growth was dense enough to screen the glow of their headlights from the highway. Soon Frank veered again, swinging the car off the lane and into the first narrow space among the trees that presented itself. Then he switched off their lights and the boys waited. In a few minutes the tail car came along the lane in cautious pursuit. The driver had been forced to turn on his parking lights to see his way ahead. No sooner had the car gone by than Frank vroomed his engine and backed out of their parking space, blocking the lane. As he switched on his lights, they saw the tail car slow to a halt, almost it seemed with an audible groan of despair. Its driver obviously realized that he was trapped. To keep going would have meant the risk of getting lost or disabled in the back country wilderness at night, well off the main artery. It seemed simpler to give up the game, as Joe and Frank gambled it would. There was a minute or two of silence. Then they saw the door of the tail car open. The driver got out in the glare of their headlights, with his hands up in a gesture of surrender. He was a young man in his 20s with wavy brown hair. His clothes seemed of foreign cut. The Hardys stayed in their seats, letting the stranger approach the front of their car. Then Frank switched on his high beams, dazzling the stranger still more. If he thought they had him covered with a gun, so much the better. Don't come any closer, Frank growled. Just toss us your identification and you won't get hurt. The stranger threw what looked like a thin leather-bound booklet. Frank caught it. It was a French passport in the name of Paul Claremont. Then came letter of introduction in English from a bank in Paris. Oh, Joe muttered as the Hardys glanced over the letter. It mentioned that the bearer, Paul Claremont, was a brother-in-law of the well-known
financier, Gustave Tabor.
Frank turned down his high beams, and the boys got out to confront the Frenchman. Realizing the two young sleuths had him cornered, Claremont glumly admitted what they had already guessed, namely that he was attempting to spoil John's chances of inheriting Gustave Tabor's fortune by making the young architect seem like a dangerous lunatic. But surely that is no great crime, Claremont insisted. The worst you can call it is a cruel prank. A prank to cheat John out of his rightful inheritance, Frank retorted. You also stole a folder from Desmond Quorn's files, Joe added, and swindled Alec Virgil out of his stuffed wolf. Claremont became frightened when he saw how much they knew. I promise you I will make amends, he pleaded, if you don't turn me in to the police. It was clear that he was afraid of getting into trouble which might be reported to Gustave Tabor. He explained that he was the young brother of Tabor's late wife, but Gustave had never liked him. Under the old man's present will, he would inherit only a small part of the estate. He had plotted to ruin John's chances as heir in hopes of getting a larger share of the fortune himself. Instead, he might be cut out of the will altogether if Gustave learned what he was up to. Knowing Gustave was hiring Elmo Yancey to investigate John, Claremont had flown to this country before Yancey took the case. Elmo already was familiar with the Tabor family's werewolf tradition, and when he learned of the werewolf scare at Hawk River, he decided this would be a good way to discredit John. He had found out from local gossip about John's hospital stay and had sent an anonymous note about this to Yancey. Frank said coldly, Are you sure you didn't start the werewolf scare yourself?
No.
I swear it, the Frenchman exclaimed. On Wednesday night he said he had sewn straps on the wolfskin and had come to plant it on the patio of the Tabor home. Then he saw John leave the house, with Yancey trailing him and Chet trailing both of them, so he too had followed. After getting into a scuffle with Chet and knocking him out, he had discovered John's studio hut. He decided the hut would be the best place to plant the wolfskin, and did so. The next day, following that, he tipped off the sheriff. What made you trail us tonight? Joe asked. Claremont shrugged ruefully. I was shadowing Yancey and saw him come to your cabin, so I wanted to find out what you two were up to and how you fitted into the picture. Now you know, Joe said with a dry grin. The Hardys decided to let the Frenchman go. As an alien he would not be hard to trace, especially since they knew his car license. Continuing their journey, they found the rendezvous house empty. With their car parked out of sight from the road, they sat waiting for Tabor and the crooked contractor to arrive. Suddenly a red light flashed on the radio. Chet was calling. What's up? Frank asked. Carell Tabor and his son drove away from their house about 10 or 15 minutes ago, the boy reported. I just got back to our place. Any idea where they were going? Looked to me like they were heading north to get on Route 30, Chet replied. Okay, Chet. Thanks a lot, Frank said and turned off the radio. Route 30, Joe muttered. That would be in the opposite direction from here. A cold suspicion began forming in Frank's mind. He looked thunderstruck. Joe, something tells me we have been decoyed from the real action. You mean Neil Xavier conned us? Sure do. But he may have spun us that yarn for his boss's sake. Where could the Tabors be heading, Frank? If they're taking Route 30, I can only think of one place. Eagle's Nest, Joe exclaimed. Right. Let's not waste any more time hanging around here. Frank revved the engine and they headed back the way they had come, then swung off on a shortcut which skirted Hawk River. Soon they were rolling north on Route 30 as fast as the law would allow. Nearing Indian Lake, they detoured to a side road and parked about a half a mile from Eagle's Nest. By approaching the site on foot through the woods, they hoped to avoid being spotted. Joe carried a long-range walkie-talkie hooked to his belt for emergency contact with Chet. Suddenly he gripped his brother's arm. Look! In a deep wooded ravine just ahead, they glimpsed the flickering light of a concealed campfire. That may be the Tabors and whoever they came to meet, Frank declared.
Come
on, let's try and get close enough to see their faces. The boys pressed forward cautiously. As they started down into the ravine, Joe lost his footing and crashed loudly into the dry brush. Their quarry heard the noise. Almost instantly the campfire was doused, as if smothered by dirt or a blanket. Figures burst from the little clearing and dashed off in the moon-dappled darkness. The boys were about to give chase but stopped short with a gasp. A weird, glowing wolf creature had just leaped into view at the bottom of the ravine. Its fangs were bared in a ferocious snarl as it charged in the Hardys' direction. Leaping lizards, Joe blurted. It's a werewolf. Chapter 19. The werewolf. The beast came at them like a demon of the night, its ears laid back, eyes ablaze with savagery. One glimpse of its deadly fangs told the boys they were facing a killer. The dart gun! Frank cried, shaking off an instant of paralyzing fear. They raced back to their car and around behind it. Frank unlocked the trunk, yanked out the gun, broke it open at the breech and rammed home the tranquilizing dart cartridge that Joe handed him. By now the four-legged fury was close enough to spring for his throat. Frank whipped up the gun and fired point-blank. The shot thundered through the night air. He saw the creature shudder and jerk in mid-leap. Then it was upon him. He went down beneath the glowing beast, holding the gun crosswise as a barrier while he struggled to keep its jaws from his throat. Joe grabbed the animal from behind, clutching it by the nape of the neck. The wolf creature growled furiously as he sought to wrestle it away from his brother. But in a few moments it began to weaken from the effects of the dart anesthetic, and finally it collapsed limply at their feet. Both boys were trembling violently. It seemed a miracle that neither had been slashed by the beast's rending fangs. Boy, you nailed it just in time, Joe panted. Look here, Frank said, pointing with the toe of his shoe toward the animal's belly. Its glowing fur appeared to be laced up on the underside of its body, from its throat clear back toward its tail. For a moment Joe could only stare in amazement. Well, for crying out loud, he muttered. The boys undid the lacing and, after considerable effort, managed to remove the creature's false coat. Its glowing pelt had obviously been made from synthetic fur colored with fluorescent dye and crafted with great care so as to encase the animal snugly, even including a head mask and 4 leggings. The beast itself was a huge, deep-chested Doberman pinscher. It's Neil Xavier's guard dog, Frank exclaimed. There was no time to assess their amazing discovery. Both boys felt it was more important to find out what the campfire plotters were up to and, if necessary, thwart their latest move. They may be planning to ruin Eagle's Nest or wreck the restoration work. Somehow, Joe conjectured. Could be, Frank said. That would make 4 Chelsea building disasters. That's their game. We've got to stop them, Joe. Flashlights in hand, the Hardys hurriedly retraced their steps to the ravine. Probing downward, they reached the site of the campfire and continued on past it, playing their beams cautiously right and left in hopes of picking up the fugitive's trail. Hold it, Joe, Frank called out suddenly. What's the matter? Hear that crackling noise? Joe listened a moment then gasped. Oh, I sure do. Both boys had the same thought. A brief reconnaissance soon confirmed their fears. In their haste to douse the campfire, the fugitives had failed to extinguish it completely, and now some of the surrounding leaf litter and undergrowth had evidently caught fire from the embers. Parched from the hot, dry August weather, the brush would go up like tinder and the trees themselves would soon be ablaze. Good grief. We'd better get out of here, Frank. You're telling me. The boys tried to run back towards their car, but found the way blocked by a wall of flames. Veering in a different direction, they sought to clamber out of the gully by one of its steeper walls. But the night breeze was spreading the blaze fast, and wherever they turned, a scorching, crackling barrier of orange-yellow flame seemed to bar their progress. Soon the whole ravine was ringed with fire. We're trapped, Joe started to exclaim in despair, but he choked back the words in his throat and snatched up the walkie-talkie from his belt. He began beaming out a call to Chet, describing their horrible plight. Come on, over this way, Joe, Frank called. Joe hurried to join him. Where are you going? There's a creek that runs through this ravine. I caught a glimpse of it in the moonlight when we were creeping up on the campfire. That'll give us a fighting chance to survive if we can find it. Blundering about in the firelit darkness, the Hardys eventually reached the shallow boggy stream. Frank had hoped that, by wading its full length, they might make their way out of the trap. But blazing trees came crashing down across the creek to block their escape. Finally they realized that their only hope was to stay hip-deep in the water and wait for rescue, or else for the fire to burn itself out. Meanwhile, Joe continued to radio for help, but no response came over the walkie-talkie's loudspeaker. What's wrong? Why doesn't Chet answer? Joe said in frustration. This ravine we're in, or the heat waves from the fire, may be interfering with our reception, Frank guessed. Let's hope it hasn't spoiled our transmission. The heat from the fire on both sides of the creek was intense. The boys splashed themselves with water to make it more bearable. Suddenly they were startled to attention by a noise from somewhere overhead. That's a plane, Frank. I know. There it is. The older Hardy boy pointed. Let's try signaling with our flashlights. They aimed their beams skyward and waved their flashlights back and forth. Whether such feeble signals could be seen among the flames seemed doubtful, but their hopes were buoyed by the appearance of possible help. Look! The plane's circling, Frank. The pilot must have seen us, or at least he's noticed there's a forest fire down here. Maybe he'll radio for help. What followed seemed like a miracle to the boys. A whitish stream began to spew downward from the circling aircraft. Hissing smoke billowed through the ravine as it hit the trees. It's chemical foam, Frank cried joyfully. Presently the pilot's voice came through over Joe's walkie-talkie. Do you read me, Hardys? Come in, please. This is Jack Wayne and Sky Happy Sal. We read you, Jack. And do you ever sound good? Joe responded. Just keep dumping that foam. After a few more passes by the plane, the blaze gradually sputtered out. Soon as the fire-blackened woods cooled enough underfoot to permit their passage, Frank and Joe clambered out of the ravine. A few hundred yards beyond, they reached the road bordering Indian Lake. Ahead, and to the right, they could glimpse Eagle's Nest looming on the hillside in the moonlit darkness. The boys ran toward it. Parked near the roadside was a light-colored four-door sedan. Frank and Joe recognized it as the Tabor's car, which they had seen standing in the driveway of the family's house. Something else lay on the roadway nearby. Frank, it's another wolf skin, Joe exclaimed, pausing long enough to snatch it up. Wow! Look at those fangs, and the claws feel razor-sharp. This one's got straps too for buckling it on, Frank noticed, playing his flashlight over the furry disguise. But never mind all that now, we can examine it later. Let's find out what's going on at Eagle's Nest. Flinging the wolf skin over the hood of the car, the Hardys hurried up the hillside. Frantic voices reached their ears. Help! Help! By this time, they were nearing the old timber mansion. Frank shone his flashlight in the direction of the cries. Two figures could be seen on the upper story porch. It's Mr. Tabor and John. They're tied up, Frank gasped. The Hardys reached the building, ran inside and up a stairway. Making their way through the ancient structure, they came out on the porch and began untying the Tabors. The scoundrels who tied us used guns to make us call for help. Karel Tabor exclaimed. Where are they? Joe asked, working busily. You didn't see them? Put in John. They must have gone out a different way. Then you came in. At that moment they heard a resounding thud, and the whole porch quivered. More blows followed. Great Scott! Cried the elder Tabor. This porch is braced with temporary supports, and they're knocking out the props with sledgehammers. As he spoke, there was a loud rending, creaking noise, and the porch started to give way. The Hardys' hearts were in their mouths as they realized they would be dumped down the steep hillside to their deaths on the rocks far below. Chapter 20. Battle Royal. The porch swayed and teetered perilously beneath their feet. Quick! Frank cried. Back inside. Moldy timbers were cracking and splitting, ancient wooden pegs coming loose. Without bothering to finish untying the two prisoners, the Hardys dragged them frantically into the building through the open doorway. Not a moment too soon. Scarcely an instant after they were inside the old mansion, a deafening crack resounded through the night air. The porch broke loose and crashed down the hillside. With deft fingers, Frank and Joe finished undoing the ropes. We'd better get out of here pronto, Frank urged, straightening up from his task.
No telling.
What those crooks'll do next. The answer was soon apparent as the Hardys and the Tabors hurried to the stairway leading to the ground floor. Half a dozen figures were about to swarm up from below. Evidently the gang had realized that their intended victims had escaped destruction, and they were coming up to finish them off in person. Frank and Joe recognized Neil Xavier's sharp-eyed visage among the upturned faces of their enemies, visible in the glare of the Hardys' flashlights. Come on, grab some of these loose timbers, Joe yelled to his companions. The floor of the musty old mansion was strewn with boards, beams and other debris. Together the Hardys seized one good-sized plank and hurled it into the midst of their onrushing foes. Carell and John Tabor followed suit. All four rained more wooden missiles on the crooks below. Then before Xavier and his accomplices could recover their weapons and collect their wits, the group rushed down the stairway and leaped on them, kicking out and punching in all directions. Despite the odds, the four held their own in the wild melee that followed. Even so, the outcome might have gone against them had two more fighters not joined the fray. The newcomers waded in, fists flying. One of the enemy quickly went down for keeps, then another as punches connected with jaws. In the shadowy gloom, illuminated by moonlight streaming through the gaping windows and open sections of walls that were being replaced or repaired, Frank finally recognized their welcome allies. It's Dad and Jack Wayne, he shouted to Joe. The fight soon ended as the crooks lost heart. Neil Xavier tried to get away, but Frank brought him down with a flying tackle. Fenton Hardy explained to his sons that he and Jack had been flying to Hawk River when they picked up Joe's radioed calls for help. Jack had landed at the airfield near Hawk River just long enough to load a tank of firefighting foam onto the aircraft. Then within minutes they had flown to the scene. It took a while to find a place to set down after the fire was out, Jack added. But I guess we got here in time. You couldn't have timed it better, Frank said gratefully. Boy, that was some scrap. Joe was nursing a set of badly skinned knuckles. If this joint was dark Eagle's Castle, he said with a wry chuckle, I guess you could call what happened a battle royal. From among the workmen's supplies inside the mansion, Carell Tabor produced several lanterns, and Fenton Hardy proceeded to interrogate the prisoners. Besides Neil Xavier, they included the crooked contractor with whom he was involved and three of the latter's gangster stooges, as well as another man who proved to be a male nurse from the Pine Manor rest home. Mr. Tabor looked pale and exhausted from the night's hectic events. However, his color gradually returned after taking some of his heart medicine, and he seemed jubilant over the fact that the mysteries troubling his firm and his family were at last being resolved. The Hardys learned that he had discovered several serious engineering errors in Xavier's architectural work. He also found out that Xavier had taken bribes to let the contractor use cheaper substandard materials than the specifications called for on construction jobs which he carried out for Chelsea Builders. Why didn't you report him? Fenton Hardy asked. I was afraid if the news leaked out it would harm our firm's good name,
Carell Tabor replied.
So I agreed to say nothing if he would promise to reform and return the bribes. To ensure this, I recorded his full confession on tape. And that's why you said nothing when Joe and I came to your office, put in Frank. Exactly. I left it to Neil's own conscience as to how much he would tell you about the stolen contents of the safe. Xavier had cleverly twisted this situation to throw suspicion first on Upton associates and then on his trusting boss, Carell Tabor himself, who was unaware that Xavier had in fact arranged the safe robbery with the help of the contractor's gangster associates in order to get rid of the incriminating tapes. Xavier had joined Chelsea Builders with high ambitions, hoping someday to become the firm's president. Under Fenton Hardy's shrewd questioning, he confessed that he had connived with the same accomplices to cause the various building disasters and thus force Carell Tabor into early retirement. However, John Tabor posed a new threat to his ambitions. The young architect was so brilliant it seemed likely he would be chosen to succeed his father as head of the company. So Xavier devised the werewolf plot in order to drive the young man out of his mind, or at least make him appear unfit to run the firm. From friendly chats with his boss, Xavier already knew about the family werewolf legend, and he gleaned other information by calling Desmond Quorn. First he had pestered John with disturbing phone calls, disguising his voice. Later, after recommending the Pine Manor Sanatorium to the young man's father, He had harried John further with ghost voices by means of electronic gimmicks, planted with the help of a friend who worked there as a male nurse. The latter was an expert hypnotist. While pretending to help John relax, the nurse had implanted post-hypnotic suggestions to make him behave suspiciously when he returned home to Hawk River. On learning that the Tabors planned to call in the Hardy Boys, Xavier had carried out the various incidents in Bayport to try and scare them off the case. He had also been the limping enmascarator at the barbecue party, another step in his war of nerves against the Tabors. Fearing that the Hardys might soon crack the case, Xavier had decided to eliminate both Corell Tabor and his son John. To do this, he had first decoyed the Hardys off on a false scent, then lured the Tabors to Eagle's Nest with an emergency phone call. Xavier's plan was to have his savage Doberman attack and kill the elder architect, which he assumed would not be difficult, given Tabor's weak heart. John would be found unconscious nearby with a wolfskin disguise, which Xavier had fashioned from a pelt the gangsters had stolen in a fur warehouse robbery. John would then be blamed for killing his father in a fit of werewolf mania. But you two punks had to spoil everything when you spotted our campfire in the ravine. Xavier snarled at the Hardy Boys. The porch accident was his substitute murder plot for getting rid of all for victims when it turned out Frank and Joe had survived the fire. His plan nearly worked too, Frank remarked to his father as the Hardys strolled outside while waiting for the state police to arrive and take charge of the prisoners. Another second or so, and we'd have taken a plunge with the porch, Joe added, then gasped. What's wrong? Fenton Hardy inquired. Joe hastily clambered up one of the broken porch supports toward something that glinted in the moonlight. When he climbed down again, he was clutching a lightly gleaming hatchet. It's Dark Eagle's silver tomahawk, cried Frank. Next day, Chet and Elena accompanied the Hardy Boys to the Mohawk village near Hawk River, where Frank and Joe presented the trophy to Hank Eagle. The Indians gazed at it and examined it with awed reverence. Dark Eagle died on the porch when he was very old, looking over the lake. Hank told the Hardys. The mansion was probably getting pretty dilapidated. Even then, the tomahawk must have fallen from his hand and embedded itself in one of the supports. You don't know how much finding this means to my people. It will always remind us of our proud past, said his uncle, the medicine man, and be an inspiration to our young ones. It might even inspire Chet to build a better canoe, Joe whispered to Elena, with a grin. Listen, she's already promised to come paddling with me, wise guy, Chet retorted. But first we're going to stop on the way back to Hawk River for a few hamburgers and a banana.